Hamataki, this is Nick Estes, the host of the Red Nation Podcast. We are joined today by a friend of mine, Natali Segovia, who is the executive director of the Water Protector Legal Collective. She's also, a longtime, environmental justice lawyer, if you want to call it that. But I've had some personal experience with Natalie, and she's done a great job of representing water protectors, but also advocating and trying to push back on the media narrative, especially as it surrounds the fossil fuel industry, and specifically fossil fuel companies like Energy Transfer, and their narrative that they push to criminalize dissent, but also to go after indigenous sovereignty and environmental rights. So, Natalie, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling from, where you're from, but also if you can just talk to us about how you got into lawyering.
Ayanshu nyo kasutimi Natali Segovia nyo kahosko Peru mantakani Nova York mantakani. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me on, Nick. It's great to talk to you. I know we haven't had a chance to touch base in a long time here, but glad that this is an opportunity to do so. My name is Natali Segovia. I'm the executive director and senior attorney at the Water Protector Legal Collective, which is an Indigenous-led nonprofit law firm and advocacy organization that began at Standing Rock. Our founding mission is really to defend water protectors, hence water protectors in our legal name. But essentially, one of the things that we started doing was facing back and pushing back against the repression that water protectors were facing at Standing Rock and experiencing from the state of North Dakota in over 800 criminal cases. So my experience coming into the law is first and foremost as an Indigenous person, as a Quechua woman, born and raised in New York, but Quechua family from Cusco, Sacred Valley of the Andes. And my husband is actually Kanaka Maoli, so have a lot of different traditions that inform my perspective and outlook on life in general, right? And I think one of the really different ways that I approach the law is bringing in that Indigenous understanding and worldview into everything that we do. And that's the same for our staff at Water Protector Legal Collective, which didn't always begin that way. It began as an organization that was primarily a non-organization. It was a call out to movement lawyers that were primarily from the National Lawyers Guild and kind of a progressive bar association, right, within the United States, many of which came from New Mexico. I know you spent a lot of time there, Nick. Many of which came from New Mexico and just rallied, right? And these are old guard lawyers. We're talking about folks like Jeffrey Haas and Flint Taylor, who represented Fred Hampton, and the Black Panthers. Pat Hanlon, who also represented, several of just movement lawyers, folks that would describe themselves as movement lawyers. And the idea behind movement lawyering is that you're not just representing an individual, you're representing an entire movement. I think my sort of political analysis and position as a lawyer grew out of that and branches out of that kind of movement lawyering tradition. But I think what we're doing at WPLC and as Indigenous lawyers that come from a different understanding of the world is informing the movement lawyering space, right, with an understanding that comes from our own relationships and our own ways of being that haven't been adequately represented in the law for decades. So we have people in the law that have, as Indigenous attorneys have taken, massive cases, right? I'm thinking about folks like Mario Gonzalez, who litigated the Sioux Nation case versus United States, or Lakota Nation versus US case, all the way through to up to the Supreme Court in the 1980s. And that was a 30-year litigation. And he's still at it. He's in his late 80s and he's still going, right? And there's a reason for that. There's a reason why when stepping beyond just being a movement lawyer, being an Indigenous lawyer, doing this work for the water, for the earth, for the people, and for our peoples, right? All of our peoples collectively. That's what keeps us going, and it's why I think other lawyers can shut off the light and close the laptop at the end of the day and call it a day. And for us, it's just a never ending cycle of how can we continue to push the law, how can we protect or use the law and the bare bones sometimes of what we have, the legal tools that we have to find some protection. And then today, I think this conversation focused on how do we push back against the law when we're seeing the law itself being used as a weapon against our peoples, against our communities, and against the environmental and Indigenous-led movement at large.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's important to give sort of props to that history of movement lawyers who came out of the 70s or 60s and 70s, defending the various power movements, and the strategies that they sort of adapted toward sort of an offensive approach to lawyering, not just one that is like about quote unquote criminal defense or defense in that sense, but one that like really kind of pushes the bounds of the law. And I think, especially in this moment in time when people are calling this current, administration as instigating a sort of judicial crisis or whatever, it's kind of ironic because it just assumes that there's one form of law that we all sort of adhere to. And that is, like a settler colonial law that's been used in many ways to diminish indigenous rights, to criminalize indigenous people as well as other people, not just us. And so in many ways it's a colonial institution, but it also sort of erases, and this is what we're going to talk about today, this idea that there are other laws that have existed prior to the formation of the United States, have existed prior to these laws, that are currently being practiced in the court, but also being enacted in legislative bodies, whether it's at the state or federal level. And that's really what I see at the heart of the water protector movement. It's like, yes, on one hand, there is treaty law, but treaty law isn't just U.S. law. Treaty law is an agreement that's made between two governments at the very least, and they each have their own interpretations of that treaty, but then also they have their own laws that govern their society. And so in this instance, and we'll get into this just to kind of update folks about what we're talking about today. Last Wednesday, a North Dakota jury ruled that the environmental NGO, and I think it was like 3 different entities of Greenpeace, must pay the Dallas-based pipeline company, Energy Transfer, more than $660 million in damages. I think that was almost twice as much, or more than twice as much, as what the original ask was. The 5-week trial took place in Mandan, North Dakota, which is also the county seat of Morton County, where in 2016, the Morton County Sheriff's Office led the crackdown on the water protector movement that opposed the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I wrote about it in this book. It's right behind me. But it was also trespassing across treaty lands of the Oceti-Sakowin and the region's main artery for drinking water, the Minnesota or the Missouri River. And so that was really, that's the kind of update, of what happened. And I think a lot of us were shocked. I mean, I was shocked. I wasn't surprised, but I was shocked at the kind of level of retribution and backlash that we're seeing at this level. But can you maybe just give us your initial reactions, Natalie, about this jury's decision to award this level of damages? And what is the bigger picture here for those of us who might have read the headlines but don't really understand the context?
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. And if I could just backtrack for a minute, I think when we say we're talking about law, it's like, oh no, this podcast is going to be really boring. It's not, because ultimately I think it's history, right, that we're talking about, and this is history in the making. And one of my favorite lines that you have in Lakota Nation versus U.S. in that documentary that everybody should see, you talk about U.S. history as often being seen as like the tree and Indian history, right, or American Indian history or indigenous history of the US being like a branch, and it's backwards, really seeing like indigenous history as the tree and US history as just a branch on that trunk that predates, right? And this is similar, what we're talking about here in terms of law and in terms of corporations and in terms of corporate power. I mean, it goes back to like the history of like the beginnings of this nation and how, even predating the states, the existence of the states, corporate charters and corporations were already in existence. And they already had more power than even the states did, at that time. And so we see this long arc of state, of corporate power and corporations having equal, if not more, power and, legal rights. I know a lot of folks talk about like legal personhood dating back to 2010. It dates back to like way before the founding of the United States. So I think it's important to just backtrack for a second and like that's what we're dealing with, is like undergirding this entire lawsuit, but also like our entire legal system, right? Is a legal system that is essentially meant to protect property rights. And I think once you understand the law as like something that's essentially meant to protect property rights, it's not meant to protect human rights. It's not meant to protect environmental rights or the people. I mean, these are like relatively new developments, right? So we're talking about most of the environmental laws in the nation exist since the 1970s. And I'm sure with the recent rollbacks, that folks have probably been reading about the Environmental Protection Agency and EPA kind of being rolled back under the new administration. We're seeing that, a lot of these things that we might have seen and thought of as set in stone haven't been set in stone, right? And so these environmental laws and these laws that have created certain protections, at least in theory, are at the core and also part of what we're talking about today in this Energy Transfer versus Greenpeace case. And what we have with the Energy Transfer Greenpeace case is essentially a case where a large corporation is using the law to not only bankrupt an organization or attempt to bankrupt an organization, the largest environmental organization in the world, possibly, right? Greenpeace has offices all over the world. And like you mentioned, it was originally a lawsuit for $300 million up to $900 million in damages, and the jury awarded over $660 million. This wasn't surprising. I think from the very beginning, Greenpeace themselves have said, the deck is sort of stacked, right? But I think if you have this understanding that within the law is meant to protect property rights. I mean, you see this play out within this case almost to the T, right? They brought up issues like trespass to chattel, right? Like chattel is like stuff. Trespass to property, right? Private property or corporate property, or specifically, things like locking down to construction equipment was like a key part of their case against Greenpeace. And then conversion, which is actually like the taking of or usage of property that's not your own. So just some really interesting kind of legal theories that they brought, and unfortunately they brought it in the same court. It was the same courthouse in Mandan where hundreds of cases that were brought against water protectors during Standing Rock. So it's part of that long line of still coming from Standing Rock, right? This is not something that's divorced from that. It is still part of that ongoing saga of what has happened since Standing Rock. We're like at the 9-year mark. It'll be 10 years soon, thinking about what has happened in these last 10 years as far as developments within the law, developments within movement, developments within kind of like the political and cultural spaces that we're in. And this is a reflection of that, right? So if we look at this case was first filed in 2017 in federal court, right? And it's been going on since 2017. And it was filed right after Energy Transfer first filed a case against former chairman Dave Archambault. So they first went after the tribe, didn't succeed, lost that one. Then they went after Greenpeace, right? And so there's been a lot of, kind of speculation in the media recently, and I think they missed the mark a bit. But they say, well, why haven't they gone after the tribe? I've been getting questions like that. I'm like, well, no, they did, right? If you go back in time, they did. They did go after the tribe. They did go after Dave Archambault. They did, in so many different ways. And so when that failed, the next best thing was, let's go after the allies. Let's go after people that showed up, right? So they went after Greenpeace. It wasn't just Greenpeace. They went after, academics. They went after activists. They went after Indigenous-led organizations. So in 2021, after this case was refiled, so it was dismissed in the Federal District Court of North Dakota in the federal court. And then a federal court has the ability to, decide if they want to take jurisdiction over state law claims. This court decided not to. So they refiled this case in state court, and they've been fighting it ever since 2019, right? So 2019 to the present, you fast forward, and in these past, 6 years, they've been still litigating this case. In that context, right, WPLC received a third-party SLAPP subpoena in 2021. So we had to defend against Energy Transfer, and they were seeking all of the legal documents from all of the cases at Standing Rock, right, to try to get access to information that could show that there was somehow some criminal enterprise, right? They're using this theory of racketeering laws and this idea that there was a concerted approach from Greenpeace along with other entities, in creating resistance to the pipeline, to the Dakota Access Pipeline. And failing at that, they just talked about a conspiracy now between the Greenpeace entities, right? Greenpeace Fund, Greenpeace Inc., and Greenpeace International. But yeah, as part of that, other people that we know, right? Indigenous activists, Indigenous scholars, Indigenous-led organizations have received subpoenas in the context of this litigation. So it extends, the ramifications of this case extend far beyond Greenpeace. But as an initial sort of response, I have to say, I wasn't surprised, but it is still very unfortunate, right? And I think it's important for us to have this conversation, to know kind of what's on deck and what's, kind of coming in the horizon, and what should we be looking out for. And how are we seeing, right, the weaponization of the law really happen since Standing Rock, and as the continuation of a long line in history that is an arc that, unfortunately isn't bending towards justice at this moment.
And it's also just kind of ironic that this case is premised on the idea that Greenpeace was essentially leading this protest in some way, or this, the actions, or that it wasn't the tribes, or that it wasn't Indigenous water protectors, that it was this outside organization that came in, this non-native organization, and took control of the situation, raised money off of it, defamed this poor, Dallas-based out-of-state company, and they were out of state. So it's frivolous, the judge and the federal judge in the previous case dismissed it with prejudice, saying that it was, this is a frivolous lawsuit. And so in this case, it's like they're creating this narrative that, somehow Greenpeace played this larger than life role. They were this kind of white savior that came into Standing Rock and directed it. And you can read that in whatever way you want to. But I also read it in another way, where it's it's going to criminalize allyship. Well, we can't really we have no grounds to go after the tribe. We have no legal grounds to actually, reverse these negative rulings against us. So we'll just go after, allies, the people, the non-native entities that went out, and, it's not even, in my opinion, it's not even really about Greenpeace, because I'm not going to say much, but I'm going to say that Greenpeace, as far as I remember, when I was on the ground, I like saw like maybe there was some people there, but it was not like the definitive experience that I had. It wasn't like, yeah, no, today we're going to hear from our brothers in Christ from Greenpeace. No, it was like they were there. I saw them maybe once or twice, honestly. Like, but they were not doing the things that they're being accused of doing, which I find really ironic. But when you have created a narrative that goes beyond just Standing Rock, you can look at it from the context of the Stop Cop City movement, that these outside agitators, and from the very beginning, actually, of Standing Rock, I remember Morton County Sheriff's Department was issuing these graphics to show that there were out-of-state protesters, right, that were coming to Standing Rock and getting arrested. And for some people who were reading it from like the opposition or the pro pipeline side, they're saying like, yeah, like we need to defend, local politics and the integrity of our institutions of law enforcement. But from the perspective of Standing Rock, not Standing Rock, but from the water protectors movement, was like, this is the importance of allyship. But also it's the idea that even like a lot of our tribal nations are not confined to states. To say we're out of state, it's like, of course we are, because we don't answer to states. That's not how tribal sovereignty works. We answer to the federal government, and treaties are federal law. They're not state law. So of course, if you want to uphold your own constitution, you're going to send people to fight this pipeline if a state is knowingly violating it. So the notion of it is absurd. And it's almost insulting to the intelligence of anyone who just knows basic law, like tribal law. It's like, yeah, this doesn't even make any sense. We don't answer to states. So why are we, of course, you're not going to pull us into a state court. You can pull us individually for, criminal charges, but you can't pull us into, as a tribal entity, into state courts. So they go after an NGO, and that's they're trying to make an example. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this, like this idea, this is Lawfare is not just about tying up entities within the court of law. It's also, there's a cultural and social impact. And maybe you can first of all define how you understand Lawfare, but then also get into the tactics of Energy Transfer and how it is enacting Lawfare in this specific case.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So Lawfare, I think the simplest way to understand it, right, is the weaponization of the law, or use of the law in a way that is as a legal offensive, with the intent to criminalize, with the intent to intimidate, with the intent to chill. And within the context of lawfare, you have strategic lawsuits against public participation, or SLAPs, which is exactly this, right? The Energy Transfer case is a classic SLAP suit, which is essentially meant to intimidate, chill, dissent. As you mentioned, it's about Greenpeace, but at the end of the day, it's not about Greenpeace, right? This is a proxy war. It's a proxy case, against tribal sovereignty. Okay, so they lost the case against the tribe initially, and specifically Dave Archambault as the tribal chairman. But in many ways, they're still going after things that are central to, right, the treaty rights and the burial sites and the sacred sites that were desecrated at Standing Rock. And they're saying, no, this is actually, they're going to the court of public opinion, right? And creating in a legal record, creating a legal record that backs up the conservative talking points of, well, people are paid to protest, there's paid protesters, there's, internal agitators. We know that there were internal agitators at Standing Rock, and that they were paid by Tiger Swan and paid by Energy Transfer, right? These were Tiger Swan infiltration of the private military and security company that was employed by Energy Transfer.
And also FBI informants too. Like, let's not forget.
And FBI informants. Exactly. Right. And one of the things that came out at trial was actually some of their expenditures on private military security companies and private security generally. And this was like in the tens of millions of dollars. So they spent tens of millions of dollars, right? This is per Energy Transfer and Gibson Dunn's own like trial exhibits. Tens of millions of dollars on security Standing Rock. And When we look at the defamation claims in this case, the defamation claims are things that we know as Indigenous peoples, and anybody that was at Standing Rock or anybody that watched the live streams or anybody that watched, the dog bites, right, and the dog attacks on water protectors, that was almost practically live on Democracy Now! There are so many third-party public sources of information that could show that the statements that they are saying were defamatory and supposedly false were actually true, right? And I think this comes down to a very concerted effort on the part of Gibson Dunn, right, as a law firm that is used to using the law in a way that is violent. And as a quick example, they took up the Brackeen case, the Anti-Indian Child Welfare Act case, all the way to the Supreme Court and ran with it pro bono. So we know that in this case, Energy Transfer versus Greenpeace, Gibson Dunn charged, I think, close to $100 million in legal fees. So imagine what the legal fees are in a case that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. If this is in federal district court of North Dakota and state court of North Dakota, now imagine what the amount of legal hours and legal capacity is needed to take up a case to the Supreme Court, right? And you can draw conclusions from there. It's the same case that brought a private corporate-backed, Chevron-backed prosecution against human rights attorney Stephen Donziger, who won a $9.5 billion judgment for Ecuadorian, indigenous plaintiffs in the Ecuadorian Amazon because Chevron dropped, and left 16 million gallons of toxic waste in oil pits in the Amazon uncovered, creating cancer and all the things that come with oil, right? And just this toxic waste that can happen when, things are not done with proper attention to the communities that live in these areas, right? And so that ended up in 990 some days, 993 days, I think, of home detention for Stephen Donziger and 40 days in a federal prison, right, for a petty misdemeanor. So the kind of, lawfare that Gibson Dunn is used to practicing, it's very intentional. And to me, it's also intentional that the tribe is not, and there's not tribal entities in this case, obviously, but the defamation claims and the statements that Greenpeace had to defend against are things that Greenpeace really had no knowledge of and has no authority to really adequately defend against, right? How do they defend the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie? Or how do they really talk about, yes, what is unceded lands? They brought in a cultural resources expert and this professor of American Indian Studies from, I think it was University of, I want to say Iowa, but he was also a non-native individual that which may or may not have played differently, I don't know, with an all-white jury from Mandan, North Dakota. So that might have been a strategic move on their end. But the fact is, and the fact remains, right, that how do you adequately talk about, and I forget the professor's name right now. I can find it. I think he's a Swiss, expert or something that has worked at University of Iowa and a couple other universities in the American Indian Studies department. So he was able to at least say, answer a little bit better than there was an Earth Justice attorney that, in the DC circuit litigation between Standing Rock and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was asked, about treaty lands and treaty rights, and the judge asked him, what are treaty lands? And he said, it's where the buffalo roam. And that was supposed to describe the 1851 treaty, right, of what are unceded treaty lands. So what we see is also problematic sometimes in the defense, right, is you have lawyers that might be really skilled at civil litigation or civil rights litigation or First Amendment litigation or constitutional law. They're not, primed and have no ability to sometimes really, or the cultural knowledge and even the historical knowledge to bring in adequately, how do we defend against these things? And how do we even do we have the language, right, to talk about treaty rights? Do we have the language to talk about unceded lands? Do we have the language to talk about cultural resources and desecration? and I think that's one of the difficulties that I saw even in the legal defense for Greenpeace. I was there on the day that Vice President of Energy Transfer Joy Mahmood got on there and said, this is all fake news about cultural site desecration and sacred site desecration. That's fake news, fake news, fake news, right? The tribe said it was desecrated, but the state is more important than the tribe. And that would have been a key moment for an attorney, right, on Greenpeace's side, or just an attorney on the defense to say what's wrong, right? Like tribal rights to treaty rights to cultural resources, and an understanding of cultural resources and sacred sites and cultural sites are on the federal level. Like these are federal laws that are protecting, right, our rights as Indigenous peoples, on par with the federal government, which trumps the states. And that just was like missing, right? And it just kind of so that was like a Joy Mahmood moment, right? Like Greenpeace Zero moment. And it was also for those of us that have knowledge of federal Indian law, and like, which is essentially constitutional law. Like the entire body of federal Indian law is constitutional law. They're all Supreme Court cases, right? And stem from like federal legislation. It was just one of those moments in the court, like, oh, like this one we could have gotten, this one we could have said, like, there could have been more, right? And it's hard in this moment to say, hindsight is 2020. Like maybe had we known as WPLC, maybe there might have been a way to support Greenpeace lawyers to like get up to speed with some of the cultural resources law. But these are some of the things that they were being asked to defend against. And in addition to, as part of the defamation claims, in addition to like the tortious interference claims and conspiracy claims. And it's just easy to get lost and kind of, it's easy to get lost in the weeds of things when you're defending a case, and not necessarily like recognize, okay, this is beyond Greenpeace, right? This is they're trying to get at Indigenous sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, Indigenous lands, and like the meaning of treaty lands, and have it on legal record. And I think that was very intentional on part of Gibson.
Yeah, I was thinking about how they're kind of like, I guess, shopping for a court, like a sympathetic court, or perhaps a sympathetic jury. And I was thinking about back to the trials of Dino Butler and Bob Robidoux, who were co-defendants with Leonard Peltier, and how they stood trial in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and were acquitted of murdering, on the charges of murdering these two FBI agents, or killing these two FBI agents on the grounds of self-defense. And Leonard Peltier was tried separately. And there's plenty of evidence that the FBI pressured, prosecutors to move it to a more like hostile or friendly, depending on your perspective, courtroom. And so they ended up moving it to Fargo, North Dakota, because they felt as if the jury would be more anti-Indian, essentially. And in fact, there was a juror who, in the middle of the trial, actually said to the judge, yeah, I said, I'm racist against, I discriminated against Native people. I said that to, somebody, and they reported it. And the judge just asked her, she goes, he just said, well, do you think you could be objective in this case? And she's like, yeah, I guess so. And then it's like, and then the case proceeded, and then he was, convicted and served to like 5 decades. And in this case, I think it was 7. I think Aline Brown, the journalist, counted 7 of the 12 jurors had links to the fossil fuel industry. So there's a definite like kind of like attitude, I guess, that they're looking for, or I guess a feeling or a vibe, or attitudes towards Native people in general. But I also just like kind of want to like reiterate that the accusations here and the idea, one was actually employed, one of the jurors was actually employed by an energy transfer subsidiary too, and still allowed to serve on the jury pools, or the jury itself. So but yeah, I was thinking about, as you were talking, this whole idea that there was this outside agitator, out of state actors who were disrupting and, causing such chaos, and like causing chaos for the tribe, but then also causing chaos for the state of North Dakota. And you're talking about tens of millions of dollars of money that's coming out of the state pockets, I'm assuming, to pay these lawyers, but also an out of state corporation that, that is like essentially leading the politics. And I don't know, it's like you can't get more explicit than that. And there's, I guess, like Republicans, it's a Republican state, kind of like, to even North Dakota's history like tries to like pride itself on this kind of like rural populism. We're really looking out for the small guy, but here this is a complete defense from all levels, from the very like, the working class people to the very top of the state government to the corporations themselves, putting up a line of defense against indigenous sovereignty and for the oil industry, while at the same time paying hundreds of millions of dollars to these places. It's almost as if, like, if you want to, like, they talk about, in some of these cases around, accusations against credibly accused priests at Indian boarding schools, they talk about activists, law firms coming in and like raising issues, and so like they're out of state, all of these things, but yet this this is clearly like qualifies, checks all those boxes. Apparently native people who are defending their water don't count, like that doesn't count as local politics. But Kelsey Warren, who lives in Texas, has more say in North Dakota than Dave Archambault. And I want to get to that because Dave Archambault was the former chair of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe during these protests, at least at the height of them. And there was an article that came out in the North Dakota Monitor about the headline is Energy Transfer Board Chair says he sought settlement with Standing Rock in 2016. And I just want to read this quote because it's pretty wild. So Kelsey Warren kind of makes this claim that he propositioned Dave Archambault about stopping, or like about making some kind of deal with Energy Transfer at the time. And Dave Archambault wrote, I guess, in response to this, what Kelsey Warren said, he said, "I let him, Kelsey Warren, know I thought this was going to be different," meaning that the meeting was going to be different. And so Warren, in his video deposition, which was showed during trial, speculated that Archambault rejected his offer to settle because he had already made a separate deal with a third party. Warren said he suspects someone had paid money to the tribe and that Earth Justice, an environmental law group, was, quote, the carrier of that money. "It was very clear to me he had struck a deal with the devil," Warren said of Archambault. This is like wild stuff, man. Like, and then Warren acknowledged that he did not have concrete evidence that this deal took place. And then, Warren has no evidence because it never happened, says Jan Hasselman, a senior attorney with Earth Justice, who previously represented the tribe. But this is a pretty wild accusation. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the context of this and what role it played in the trial that just happened.
Yeah. So Kelsey Warren, actually, this was like pre-trial was a huge issue because Greenpeace has been trying to get his deposition for quite some time, and Energy Transfer kept blocking it and blocking it and blocking it. And you kind of wonder why, right? If there's like, again, there's nothing to hide, like, why would you, this is your chief operating officer. Of course he's going to be somebody, or chief executive officer, excuse me. Like, of course he's going to be subject to deposition, right? In this kind of litigation. But when you have Kelsey Warren is also this individual that has said, activists should be like wiped out from the gene pool. Like, there is if you go on YouTube, like the video is on YouTube, right? It's searchable. So his idea and understanding and kind of what came out of activists and environmental protectors in general is that, right, is like anybody that stands up for the environment or for the earth or is quote anti-pipeline is suddenly like an agitator or somebody that should be wiped out of the gene pool. I mean, those are fighting words, right? And those are really heavy words. But in the context of this case, Kelsey Warren, his deposition was shown at a moment in trial where there had already been a lot of testimony about kind of setting up this fake news narrative, setting up like this narrative of outside agitators, of like protesters coming in and Greenpeace fitting into that whole narrative. But what also is interesting was he essentially brings out this idea that like Greenpeace was the one that, had he known at the time, like they were the ones and not Earth Justice, right? That was the ultimate like transcendence of this point is like he initially thought it was Earth Justice. Had he known better, it was actually Greenpeace. But the idea, again, I mean, it's paternalistic at best, right? The paternalism there is really high to think that, and David Archambault definitely pushes against it in his quote in the North Dakota Monitor, but he says like this was beyond me as like, or beyond him as chairman, right? And it was beyond Standing Rock. Like the movement had grown, and it was an indigenous led movement, and it was an organic movement, and it was something that grew right out of like respect for the water and respect for the treaty rights, and that's what prompted people to go. It wasn't Greenpeace or an organization or an NGO. And so the idea that like NGOs are the ones that have to, or the ones that are going to come in and necessarily like fight for tribal sovereignty, when indigenous peoples have been fighting for their own sovereignty and self-determination since time immemorial, right? Like predating NGOs. So I think I think the article is really good, so I invite people to read it. But it is one of these wild moments in the case where you sort of see the MO, like the modus operandi rate of like how these oil companies operate. I know folks, some of the people I've been in touch with, other lawyers and academics and legal scholars were like shocked that Kelsey Warren was, on record saying that he had taken like an offer, right, to Chairman Archambault, right? And they're like, it's a bribe. I'm like, yeah, but this is how they operate every single time, right? Like there's a video on also YouTube. It was a town hall meeting from like West Wind Minerals, and they're like, what can I do? What can we do so the tribe like will let this mining project go forward, right? That what can I do or what can be done is like the quintessential question that is asked every single time.
Sorry, it was a little confusing reading this quote, but like what's funny about it is that Kelsey Warren's basically calling himself the devil because he's like, he didn't accept my bag. He made a deal with the devil. It's like, bro, you are the devil. Like, so you brought a bag of cash that you wanted him to accept. I mean, essentially saying he took a bribe before before I got to him. So it's like, I just thought that was really ironic because I don't know if he's self-aware that like, bribing people is wrong. First of all, but he's like calling
Right,
himself the devil.
exactly.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's a lack of self-awareness, but I mean, it's also just like this idea that like feeds into this narrative that has been like constructed over time, right? Like this narrative of like environmentalists are eco-terrorists, right? Like that equation and that analogizing for oil companies and extractive industry has been around since at least the 1980s. And that kind of analogizing for them, I mean, it's part of how they work. Like Aline Brown has this great article that she published at The Intercept, or maybe it might have been actually afterward. I think it's at The Intercept when she was working on Line 3, but she was talking about how, Line 3, they called in executives that were like trained in counterinsurgency, right? That was all of Tiger Swan. Tiger Swan was like all like ex-military guys that have been like trained in counterinsurgency, and like leaked documents, right, showed that they talked about water protectors as jihadists, right? Like that like link can't be lost on us. Like we have to understand that that's how they see anybody that's standing up like on a front line, anybody that's a water protector, an earth defender, a land defender, a human rights defender, period, full stop, is somebody that to them is like amounts to as close to an eco-terrorist as it gets, right? And like there's an amicus brief we wrote in the Jessica Resnicek case that went up to the circuit. Jessica Resnicek was a water protector from Iowa, and she created some, pipeline damage to property. Again, it was like property damage in 2017 to the segment of Dakota Access Pipeline that ran through Iowa. Through a non-operational pipeline. So there was like no possible damage or like threat to like human life or anything like that. But what you're seeing is sorry, I'm getting some call here. What you're seeing is essentially there in that case, like the criminalization of Jessica Resnicek as setting a really dangerous precedent at that time. That is still, it's linked to this idea, right? Into like the ideas that Kelsey Warren has and that Energy Transfer and Gibson Dunn has about the environmentalist movement writ large, right? And at the time, in Jessica Resnicek's case, I mean, there were 84 US senators that wrote a letter, right, to the Attorney General, Merrick Garland at the time, asking the Attorney General to hold environmentalists and environmental activists like Resnicek that created property damage, that committed property damage, anybody that commits property damage as an eco-terrorist. But in that amicus brief, we go into that history of it, and it's like if you do the digging, and we've done a lot of that digging, is like in the 1980s, there's this guy named Ron Arnold, and he was father of the wise use movement, and he kind of coined this phrase eco-terrorism, but it's an industry coined term, right? And so I'll just read a quick quote here, but he said, "We want to destroy environmentalists by taking their money and their members. No one was aware that environmentalism was a problem until we came along. Facts don't matter. In politics, perception is reality." So this is the guy that coined this term, right? Eco-terrorism. And in this congressional hearing, he coined it in a 1983 article. And he was part of this organization that was really trying to open up like millions of acres of federal wilderness for commercial development. So again, like really thinking about how extractive industry at large like is constantly working on like how do we gain access to all of these protected areas, right? Why are they protected? They're protected because maybe they're like old growth forests, right? Like in Atlanta, or they're protected because it's the Arctic region in Alaska. Yes, it's oil rich, but it's one of like our last like, wild areas. And also it's in some important area for biodiversity. I mean, just all of these areas are protected for very specific reasons. And then when you talk about treaty rights and treaty lands and the rights of indigenous peoples, right? I mean, the vast majority, I think especially now in the kind of green transition and like just transition approach to, or conversations around just transition to greener energy, the statistics are something like 75% of, natural resources that are untapped are close to or within 30 to 35 miles of an Indian reservation in the United States. And in the like worldwide, it's even more, right? Like it's either on or close to indigenous lands. So the fact is that like we're constantly as indigenous peoples having to face, a struggle for our own survival, our survival of the water and survival for future generations. And it's the survival for everybody that drinks like water from the Missouri watershed, right? That's 18 million people. From Lake Oahe, it's 809 federal, state, and tribal irrigation sources, right? It's not just our water we're protecting, it's water and the land. Like there's only one earth, right? Like how do we, I know Elon Musk really wants us to go to Mars, but it's like, okay, can we not colonize? Like, do we have to colonize Mars too? Like, can we just protect this earth, right? But yeah, this idea of like eco-terrorism has been under development since the 1980s, and it's around, right? It's one of these lawfare tactics. It's actually, if you look at the congressional history, there have been congressional hearings on the use of on eco-terrorism since 1988. There was one in 1988. There was one in 1998. There was one in 2002. There was one in 2005. The last I really checked was when we wrote this amicus brief for Jessica Reznicek. But like you're looking at like a constant, push to further define what ecoterrorism is, and every time the definition just gets broader and broader and broader, and ultimately, this Ron Arnold guy during one of the congressional hearings, he defined ecoterrorism as acts to save nature or crime to save nature, including every crime from trespass to murder. So that's like the entire like criminal law textbook, right? Every crime from trespass to murder. And he's saying that's the definition of ecoterrorism. So if that's not lawfare and not the weaponization of the law, like I don't know what is, right?
Yeah, thanks for that really like in-depth answer. And just to kind of talk a little bit about Jessica Reznicek's case, and thanks for bringing this up, because it was actually one of the questions that examples I was going to use, and it was pointed out in the comments too that she was a member of the Catholic Workers Movement, and she had also her and her accomplice admitted to like peacefully, their words, sabotaging parts of the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that's kind of who Kelsey Warren was referencing when he said these people need to be wiped from the gene pool. And the original charge was like, I think, they were very careful like to not harm humans, not harm animals. It was just directed towards property damage. And the recommended sort of sentencing for that kind of crime that they admitted to, they would have, if they had not said anything, my understanding is that they might not have actually gone to court, but nonetheless they admitted to doing it, and the recommended sentencing was like 3 to 4 years. The federal judge added terrorism enhancement to her sentencing, doubling her prison sentence to 8 years. And to put that into perspective for folks who are listening, the January 6th rioters who in a planned attack destroyed government property and assaulted police at the U.S. Capitol were sentenced to an average of 60 days, with only one being convicted of serious terrorism charges. I'm reading from a speech I gave on this topic because I was looking it up because I was trying to find when terrorism enhancement charges had been used, but federal prosecutors and judges actually rejected terrorism enhancement sentencing in all the other cases, despite the FBI director Chris Wray, who's like no friend to Native people, characterizing January 6th as domestic terrorism. So like even and now today, most of those people are free on pardons, right? So you have like, this is now that kind of assault. So like Jessica Reznicek, Catholic worker, very kind, peaceful person, burns holes in a pipeline and then admits to it, essentially asking to be arrested and to stand trial in an act of conscience, opposition to the fossil fuel industry, versus these white supremacists, neo-Nazis, I mean the whole gamut of the right, engaging in like a form of destruction and violence against the US Capitol, our most quote unquote sacred institutions, not facing the same, like, if you talk about terrorism, it evokes, has a legal definition, but it's a political use of violence. And if that's not a political use of violence, I don't know what is, in that regard. And I'm not like defending or condemning anybody. I'm just talking about the facts here. But it's interesting how this word terrorism now applied to water protectors specifically, not just environmentalists, but the water protector movement, people who identify with it, and now being applied to the gamut of people who just dissent against U.S. foreign policy or pipelines. Right? We're seeing this kind of, it's not even a corporate takeover of the state. Like the law in this case is all about class power. It's about maintaining class power. It's about attacking movements that kind of challenge, the corporate control of the United States, which has always been, that's where these laws arose from, essentially, is to protect their power, to protect their interests. That's how the law works. And in spite of the environment, in spite of working class poor people, in spite of indigenous people, in spite of black people. Like that's how the system has worked over and over again. And I just, I have two like final questions, but one is to really look at Gibson Dunn and the environmental crimes that they're defending. The they obviously, you said earlier about their pro bono work with the Brackeen case to undermine, to essentially undo laws preventing the genocide of Native families. That is the separation of children from their parents. That is a legal form of genocide. That's the definition of genocide. They want to reverse that and overturn it because they see that as sort of a back door to undermining tribal sovereignty. So that's one aspect of it. But there's to this day, the Dakota Access Pipeline is functioning despite a court order for it to stop functioning because it hasn't done proper environmental reviews. That was not allowed. That aspect of the case was not allowed to be heard by the trial, by the jury. I don't know if it would have an impact, especially if 7 out of the 12 are working, for the fossil fuel industry, and one of them is working for an energy transfer subsidiary. But nonetheless, those are important facts that didn't really get addressed either in the media, at least the mainstream media. But anyways, if you want to comment on that, and I have a final question about just like where do we go from here, because it seems really bleak, but I'll save that till after you answer this one.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I know we could probably talk about this for a couple more hours. Frankly, there's just so much to unpack here. But one of the things I encourage folks to look at the jury verdict document itself. It's linked on our WPLC website. It really walks through like all of the issues that were in the case, right? Like the 9 defamatory or allegedly defamatory statements that Greenpeace engaged in, which were like Dakota Access Pipeline crosses Standing Rock's through tribal lands. And the jury said, oh, that was false. That water protectors were sprayed and used excessive force used against water protectors at Standing Rock and attacked with dogs. Jury said that was false. That sacred sites and cultural sites were desecrated at Standing Rock. Jury said that was false. I mean, it's this, kind of turning on its head of everything that we know to be true. But one of the things so I encourage folks to read that and kind of like look through it, because as much as there's been a ton of media coverage on the case, like they haven't actually looked at, what is the core of these defamatory statements? How do these things actually hurt like our peoples, indigenous peoples and the tribe, and even right further this state versus tribe narrative that is happening and has been kind of on the rise since McGirt, right? Since the McGirt case found like, oh, actually vast swaths of like Oklahoma are still tribal land, and people are like, what? So I think that's an important thing, is to always go back to these sources, right, and look at these things. But this case is something we need to keep an eye on, right? As anybody involved in the environmental justice movement or the indigenous movement for protecting the earth and protecting the water, like we have to know what's happening in the law and what the developments are, right? Since Standing Rock, there were critical infrastructure bills passed, and over 49 critical infrastructure bills passed, considered in at least like 45 different states. There's like still bills pending, and there have been at least 342 bills like under consideration to restrict the right to peacefully protest, to restrict the right of like assembly, to restrict the right of having any kind of protest near any kind of pipeline or anything deemed critical infrastructure. But what we're seeing overall is like a shrinking of civic space, right? And a shrinking of any kind of voices and like ours and those of our allies that stand with indigenous-led movements, a shrinking of that space and a chilling, right? And I got a question from a reporter this past week asking, well, like, what would you advise like organizations like yours that are indigenous, that are doing this kind of work? Like, how will you change things? And I think it's important for all of us to, yes, have all of the legal compliances and have all the legal check boxes like checked off, right? And know our rights, know our responsibilities. But at the end of the day, like what they want is for us to cower, and what they want is for us to be fearful. And I think knowledge is power. And having read Nick's book, right? Like it's a compilation of like all of the things that we have known historically to be true, and we're seeing history in the making, right? This is still part of that historical narrative and that historical arc. So understanding this in the context of the law that it is, laws that are meant to protect private property and not indigenous water protectors, not allies that show up to protect the water. Like having that understanding going into this, I think is helpful, and it helps. But it's also really important that we know that like this is a moment that still requires courage, right? And I think we're seeing that in every space that we're in within society right now. I think that the current administration, like it thrives on fear, right? And we're seeing the rise of a corporatocracy. People like using the word oligarchy, but at the end of the day, like you're seeing corporate power just rise to the top. And it's been that way for a long time, right? It's just like suddenly the veil has been lifted and we're seeing things as they truly are, right? So I think this is the time when we have to know what is required of us under the law, but also know that we have a responsibility to continue fighting, and we have a responsibility to not let fear get the best of us, right? Because we have, it's a moment for courage, and it's a moment for solidarity, and we're good at that. Resilience is a part of us as Indigenous peoples, and relationality is a part of us as Indigenous people. So be a good relative, and that's where what we have to do and where we have to be.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us for this live feed. If you want to check out your work, I highly recommend everyone go to waterprotectorlegal.org. There's some great documents that you've shared on there. There's some press releases that you've shared on there. But also, if there's anything that you would like to uplift in this moment where people who are listening or watching can get involved to support your work or projects that you're working on right now or supporting.
Yeah, visit us online, waterprotectorlegal.org. Instagram is probably like the platform we post on the most these days, but have a lot of ongoing updates. We'll be updating continuously. Energy transfer is still facing an uphill battle, and the uphill battle is that Greenpeace isn't going to roll over. I think the movement's not going anywhere, right? The idea, I think it was Fred Hampton that said that you can, jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail the movement, right? Jail the revolution. And it's the same thing here, right? Like Greenpeace is going to fight back. They are going to appeal. I think they have said as much. So they are going to continue to need that support in general. But I think it's just important to have. So we'll keep updating folks on Instagram, and we'll let people know about all this information as it rolls out. I think the other thing to keep in mind too, we are giving. We're constantly updating too on the Standing Rock lawsuit. So there is a lawsuit currently in place by the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It's pending in the D.C. Circuit. And part of what's underlying this is the idea that energy transfer was federally debarred. Federal debarment comes when a company has committed crimes or has been dishonest in their public filings. So actually, they failed to report spills in Pennsylvania and Ohio that led to federal debarment and the conviction of at least 23 criminal convictions for environmental crimes. Right, for like lacing their drilling fluid in their drilling process with things like diesel. You can't drink oil, right? The last time I checked, and I think we know that for sure. So that is still ongoing. Under the Trump administration, just as soon as they came in, the federal debarment was just lifted, just lifted. And it had been in place for 3 years. But we're still talking about a pipeline that's still operating illegally. It's operating without proper permitting, right? And in this case, I think you mentioned it, Nick, right? There was an exponent report, a report that was issued by an expert report from Greenpeace, prepared for Greenpeace, that said 1.4 million gallons of drilling fluid, potentially toxic drilling fluid, reached the waters of Lake Oahe. This is exactly what water protectors are trying to protect against from happening, right? Like a leak. And we don't know, right? At the same time as this pipeline, Dakota Access, was being constructed, pipelines in Pennsylvania and Ohio were being constructed, and the drilling fluid in those pipelines were laced with things like hydrocarbons and diesel fluid, right, to make it easier. So the question is, well, if they were doing this there, could they have been doing something like that at Standing Rock? And it's an unanswered question. They're not regularly reporting to the pipeline, to PHMSA, which is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Administration, Security Administration. So I think there's a lot of things still here at play, right? And we are trying to gain access to about 8,000 documents that have been sealed under protective order in this case, in the Energy Transfer versus Greenpeace case, but they're all related to pipeline safety documents. And it's all evidence that Greenpeace was not able to use a trial, that the judge blocked and said, nope, you can't bring in the expert that says that there were leaks that made it to the water. And you can't bring an expert in that says, he really stopped them from being able to use that at trial. But that's all pending. And part of that, the federal debarment undergirds the Standing Rock Sioux Tribes case against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but also is a case ultimately against the Army Corps of Engineers, as seeing, there's a federal environmental impact statement pending, final EIS pending in this case. And in the meantime, this pipeline is still operating illegally. And Standing Rock is yet to receive, emergency measures that are unredacted from Energy Transfer. So what that means is they're saying, yeah, they can shut down in the event of a leak. They can shut down the pipeline in 9 minutes tops. There are no safety valves on this pipeline. I know folks that have worked in water for a long time and in water systems, and you always have to have pipeline or like safety valves, right? Like you're able to shut off different segments of the pipeline. There are no safety valves. Let me just say that again. There are no safety valves in the Dakota Access Pipeline. So the idea that a pipeline that is pumping millions, hundreds of millions of barrels of oil, that can be shut down in 9 minutes is wishful thinking. And that's part of what the tribe is pressing for too. They're saying, give us the emergency measure, like response plans. What are the emergency response plans? Why are these redacted? And that's part of the lawsuit that's pending in the DC circuit, currently under Judge Boasberg, who's the judge that Trump has in his crosshairs right now, and seeing, he's an activist lefty judge. What we've seen is that he's been a fair judge, and has been able to cut through the politics and see the issues for what they are. So much more to talk about, but thank you so much, Nick, for having me on here today, and hope we can continue sharing in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is an issue and a movement that, like you said, it's next year is going to be 10 years. I didn't even think about that, a decade out. So this is it's pretty wild that there's still lawsuits going on, and that there's still litigation, and that there's still trolling, and trying to dredge up things against water protectors, against, the tribe. But you will definitely have you back on. Maybe we'll have you back on for a victory, hopefully soon, that we can celebrate and talk about. But yeah, thanks so much, Natalie, for joining us. This is really insightful, and take care. And I hope you join the podcast again. So
Thanks so much.